Imagine having the Tourette syndrome and barking unexpectedly. And then fast forward, imagine that you doing a keynote at MPI World Education Conference in Louisville. Today, I have the great pleasure of speaking with Pamela Schuller, and that is exactly what she did. Enjoy the conversation with Pamela. Hello, and welcome to a new episode of the Business of Meeting podcast. A few weeks ago, I had immense pleasure to attend MPI World Education Conference in Louisville and listen to an amazing person with a fabulous story, what touched me a lot. Not only her story, the way she delivered it. And I'm so glad that the one and only Pamela Schuller is here with me today. How are you, Pamela?
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you very, very much for taking the time. I always ask my guest, what's your story? But actually, that is part of your keynote and what you said on stage. But please, for those who don't know you and are listening, what is your story?
So I'll give you like the quick elevator. I have Tourette syndrome and obsessive compulsive disorder. I'm also 4'6.5". And I have a master's in advocacy and degrees in executive coaching. And I've been a comedian for years. And I combine all of those. So I do comedy and storytelling about really inclusion, accessibility, and mental health. And I humor stories and real concrete tips and tools. And I get to work with companies and colleges and nonprofits all over the world.
Oh, and I see that you've made appearance or speech with Netflix, Dr. My Video, NBC, Disney, Google, Geico, Salesforce. I mean, there's the whole list.
Yeah, it shocks me every day that I get to do what I love and people keep inviting me back to do it. I have a great getting to do this. And I have been to a lot of conferences on diversity and inclusion and accessibility. And I feel like I do it a little bit differently. And that's not to say the other ones aren't fantastic. I do it a little differently.
Absolutely. And you tell your story. And if you can share one of two examples that you share on stage, and maybe we can go back first to when you're a child. When did you discover that you had Tourette and compulsive disorder? And what happened with your parents? What happened with the kids? Kids can be terrible with each other. Trust me, I know just a little bit about that, but kids can be awful with other kids. If you can share one or two stories that you shared.
So I'll start with this that I didn't share on stage, but I was diagnosed in like first grade because my mom was watching an episode of the Maury Povich show on Tourette syndrome. And she was like, oh, that's what she has. And went and got me diagnosed a week later. So I was diagnosed in about first grade, but it became really severe in about fifth, sixth grade. Trying to think of which stories I love telling. There's so many. I have a lot of stories. I think peers weren't necessarily mean. They just didn't, I felt isolated. I was alone for a lot of my childhood. I think adults struggled more with me because my Tourette's was disruptive. At this point, when you look at me, you might not notice it right away. It depends on the day. I have days, weeks, months where it's very noticeable and kind of everything in between. But as a kid, it was the first thing you noticed. I mean, I would walk into a room flailing, barking, making noises. I threw my head back so hard and so many times as a kid, I broke my own neck. I was out of school for years on so many medications. And so I very much remember the way the world started treating me differently. And the messaging was that I take away from the world, that I was something other people had to work through. When they did include me, it was to like do a good deed, not because they wanted me there or they saw value in me being there. And I internalized all of that and I ended up getting shipped away to boarding school. So in my keynote, a lot of what you hear is the journey at boarding school to love what makes me me, which ended up being through them putting me in stand-up comedy.
Stand-up comedy, when you are sometimes starting to bark without controlling it. How was that? Tell us a bit how you felt and the stress you must have experienced.
So the keynote you hear is about what it looks like to embrace your fears and how I still bark from Tourette's and it's still a little bit scary. And I've realized to live my dream life, I have to just lean into barking because otherwise I'd never leave my apartment. And so as a kid, barking was a reason not to go anywhere or do anything. As an adult, I'll share a story with you that now I've leaned into it. I live in a little New York City studio apartment with thin walls and a no pet policy. And I often bark before I go to sleep. And people in my building started complaining that I had illegally gotten a dog. So at one point, the owner of my building showed up unannounced and she knocked on my door and I answered. And she was like, I'm so sorry to bother you. There have been multiple reports that you have illegally gotten a dog. And as you know, you can't have a dog here. I'm here to do an animal check, see that you have a dog, and we're going to have to go from there. And I was laughing so hard. I had tears streaming down my face. I knew immediately this was like the funniest thing that had ever happened to me. And I finally mustered up the words like, cool, cool, cool. Here's what's happening. I have Tourette's. I bark at night. There is no dog. Look around. And she like quickly, my apartment is 120 square feet. Like I live in New York City. She quickly realized there's nowhere to even hide a dog here. I wasn't lying. I have no dog. And she came back mortified. And she was like, Pamela, I'm so, so sorry. If anyone else complains, I'm never coming back here again. You have my word. And she like took my little hands in her hands. And she was like, I promise you, you're never going to hear from me about this again. If anyone else complains, it stops with me. She hugged me 3 times. She was like, promise me you accept my apology. And I was like, of course I do. And then she left. And an hour later, I went out and I got a dog. Right? From struggle comes inspiration. And I think my brain views it differently now. As long as I'm not at risk of getting hurt, right? As long as I'm not in a situation where people think I'm being mean or barking at them, there's always a way to find the positive in it for me. Now I have a dog.
She's not listening.
I do too. And I told that story somewhere else and it went viral. And every day I was like waiting. I was like waiting for her to show up again. But no, I think I scared her.
That's funny. When you have that condition, and you also tell a story where your eyes are clicking, and when people think that, what was the story you mentioned about that?
Oh, people think I'm winking at them all of the time.
Yeah.
I do a ton of keynoting, but I also am still a stand-up comedian. I do shows, around New York all the time. And I had a guy come up to me after a show and say, were you winking at me? And I was like, either that or I have a neurological disorder ego. Like he just assumed, which means he didn't listen to a word that I said because I did stand up about having Tourette's.
When there's so many things so many people and so many challenges that people have, we're talking about inclusion, but true inclusion, not the what I call the marketing inclusion to tick the box and say, oh, look how great I am.
Yeah. And there's a difference. And I feel it. I feel it when I'm in a company or community. I feel it when I'm a checklist item versus something that they're really working on and they want to learn.
Tell us about that.
When I am hired by communities or companies that really want to do the work and get to the next level, yes, it's a keynote and a show, but it's also a conversation. And the questions feel different, right? Like I almost always do a Q&A after a keynote, and the questions just feel more like 2.0 or 3.0. Where like I gave them some basics, I gave them some tools, I gave them a mindset. We're on the same page now, and they want to like go deeper and do the work. And I see it when companies hire me back, which that's my favorite. When I get to go back to a company I've already keynoted and lead workshops and get them like to that next level. And, I have workshops on everything like, okay, you hired people with disabilities. What does it look like to truly create a space where you get to see the best out of your employees? I think sometimes we view inclusion almost like community service or like something one group does for another, as opposed to like something we all do, because when we all get to bring our best self to the company, to the team, we all benefit. And so looking at it more through that lens of like, we're doing this because we benefit when it's done well, like our bottom line benefits.
When you have a company that is hiring you back, what concrete action can you implement and what is the outcome that you see in those organizations?
It's different company to company. And some of it's like, are we talking inward facing or outward facing? Are we talking about inclusion at like the water cooler, right? Or are we talking about your company and the way you deal with clients and support clients and in that way? And so a lot of what I do is especially if I'm being hired back and we're doing more of a deeper dive in workshops, some meetings. What are your goals? What do you see happening? Because there are a lot of companies doing incredible things. Doesn't mean we can't get to that next level. And there are a lot of companies that are newer to this, and this is kind of newly on the radar, and that's amazing. And I don't want to make it so overwhelming it's impossible. We want to give actionable steps and things that are concrete. So I start with getting everyone on the same kind of mindset on the why and the what, and really the why. And then we go from there. We build together.
I think I mentioned that to you when we briefly spoke in Louisville a few weeks ago. And forgive me if I'm sure you know who I'm talking about. It's an amazing artist who was on stage who has Tourette. And he couldn't keep on singing because he had a moment with Tourette. And just telling you that, I have tears in my eyes and goosebumps. The entire crowd starts singing with him. And that to me was the perfect example of people accepting and being together.
Not only that, but the moment was better because of it, right? I think that's the difference. We leaned into it. When I was a kid and my Tourette's was really severe, I hadn't gone to a movie in years. And I remember being at boarding school and Legally Blonde came out and I like needed to see it, but I had been kicked out of theaters. I hadn't gone to a movie and I was really petrified. And I remember working up the courage, like, I'm going to go. I'm going to explain Tourette's to the audience, to anyone at the theater. I'm going to do this. I want to see this movie. And the morning of and I like called the theater and I told them I had Tourette's and I asked them when, the least people were there because I don't want to disrupt other people's experience. And they told me, and it was going to be like a morning on a weekend. And I walked downstairs from boarding school ready to, like, for the very first time, go to a movie in years. And I get to the bottom of the stairs and my entire boarding school is there. They had all decided to come to the movie with me so that I wasn't doing this alone. And I'm going to be honest, I don't remember seeing the movie. I remember feeling just so embraced and loved for who I was. And that was like a transformative moment for me. Kids, teens, kids and teens, I did a corporate keynote last year and it was great. I loved it. I did similar to what you heard about embracing fears. And one of the C-suite members, and he gave me permission to share this without his name, cried to me after it. And we had this moment and he said, my kid is going through some tough stuff right now. And yes, that was great for the company, but I needed to hear it. And then he said, when are you leaving? And I said, tomorrow's my flight. And he said, can we change it? And can I hire you to go perform at my son's school? And I did. And I think that to me says, like, gosh, we are craving this. We're craving, and that's not just for people with disabilities. It's anyone who feels on the outside or like quietly feels like who they are maybe takes away from the world. We are craving these messages and the tools to make it better.
Absolutely. And that I would say is for anyone craving to be the belonging part, the purpose part, the solitude part. Now you're outgoing and you make it sound like, yeah, I had this, but I did that. And I'm sure it was not easy. And you had moments where you felt extremely, somebody's listening and feeling that same situation. What's your advice? Because when I see you today and I saw you on stage, you're absolutely amazing. You're outgoing, you're smiling, an amazing personality. What is your advice when you're in the deep of, in the valley? What was it, the name of it? When you are in the valley of the shadow of death.
Oh, yeah.
What is your advice?
So when I was a kid, my Tourette's was so severe that I think, I don't know if I said this, but I like broke my neck from throwing my head back. I was out of school for years. My appendix ruptured. And while I think today you see a different kind of Tourette's, I'm still ticking constantly. It's just not always noticeable. And I would be lying if I said I was this positive every day. I think the biggest advice is that I ask for help when I need it. There's no shame in asking for help. I love my little nerdy neurologist. I have an occupational therapist. I have a clinical, like I have so many people on my team. And I also know that that's a privilege to be able to pull some of those pieces in, but there are a lot of organizations and companies working to make it more accessible. So that's one thing. And it also doesn't have to be clinical. It could be friends, family. I know what it feels like to be a version of me that I love. And sometimes it means pulling in help. And I'm going to also be honest that a few months ago, I went through a few weeks where my Tourette's was so painful and I did everything in my book. I did everything that I have. And I remember calling my mom and saying, I'm out of ideas. I've tried the things. And I remember thinking, I just have to kind of sit with this for a minute and know it won't always hurt this bad. And it won't always feel like that. And I think that's like a mental health tool of sometimes you have to sit in the literal pain and the emotional pain, pull in the tools, do a lot of self-care, and then go back to like, what about you adds to this world? And I share that story when I'm on stage where I found that I was funny in detention at boarding school because they put me in stand-up. And when things are really rough, I remind myself what I love about myself. And that's my reason to keep going.
I can see that. When you had this moment and like you mentioned, embracing your fears or your keynote and embracing the situation right now. This is not how we are raised. We are raised to find solution immediately. We are raised to have an issue. Okay, let's tackle it. You need to win. You need to, who in your life help you basically look at this philosophy of looking at life differently and helping you go through it?
A lot of people. I try to live in the and, that means like I have Tourette's, OCD, anxiety, and I'm creative and funny and quirky. And sometimes that means like, it doesn't mean that I only get to enjoy the parts of me that I perceive as polished. It means I enjoy all of it because it all adds something to my life, even if it's hard. And I think there were a few people, I had some educators along the way that I still keep in touch with that were amazing. My English teacher at boarding school, which I call Weird Kid Boarding School, she told me I could be as inappropriate as I wanted as long as it was in my art. And you better believe I found the line. I went for it. I crossed all of the lines. I used all of the bad words, but she allowed me to kind of then find my voice and my footing with creativity, and allowed me to get some of that anger out in stand-up, in slam poetry. So she was really, really transformative for me and huge, and saw me for me. She was like, yeah, like your Tourette's is really bad and you're really inappropriately funny. And let's see if we can channel some of that. She was the one that put me in stand-up. And there were so many other people. I mean, my sister is a high-powered businesswoman and I think saw me for me early. And I got to kind of see that she struggles with things too. And she was able to like lean into them and become a businesswoman. I'm lucky that for every person who gave me the message of like, you take away from the world, disability is bad or different, I had voices of people being like, you're weird and quirky and you just have to find it.
I like this philosophy of and for the little I know about improv, this is one of the improv 101.
Yes. And yeah. And I teach that as a tool to meet people where they are. In improv, yes and is this idea that you accept what's happening as truth without judgment and you build from there. And it's an improv it's a tool for that, but it's really it's a tool for everyone. I use it for my agency, right? Like, yes, this person is staring and laughing at me and I get to decide how I want to respond. I get to decide if I want to educate, if I want to be snarky, if I want to let it go. Yes. And I teach that in business setting too. What does it look like to like, yes, this person on our team doesn't do small talk, struggles with one-on-one, conversations. Okay. And they're also amazing at these three things. What does it look like to let them shine in what they're amazing at and not kind of get stuck in the things that maybe are not their strong suit? And what does it look like to support them in a way that works for them?
So I was just listening to you and thinking about improv. My sister-in-law lives in London and out of the blue was asked to do a stand-up, which he performed, and I could hear on the video people laughing in the room, which is an amazing feeling.
Oh.
But how do you start? What are the ideas? How do you get the ideas? How do you train? How do you test? How do you remember? How do you do that?
So it's always a little bit different. And I won't say that the way I did it is the way everyone should do it. But if you're interested in stand-up, you start with 2 or 3 minutes of comedy and go to an open mic and be okay with knowing that like part of the journey is building resilience because not every show is going to be great. And I'm thankful that comedy helped me build resilience because it kind of travels into my whole life now. But start there, start 2 or 3 minutes. I think my brain is wired to write jokes. When I tour and I'm performing places, I'm careful never to write things in a mean way. But, I had someone come up to me after a show a few weeks ago and said, I'm going to pray for you in your condition. And my brain, without thinking, said, oh, you don't have to. Because if your prayers work, I might have to get a real job.
I love it.
I'm always kind of, my brain works like that. And never in like a mean way, or I, at this point, work pretty clean so that I can do companies and things like that. But that's where you start, 2 to 3 minutes of finding the jokes in your life. And I like to say, what makes your point of view different than everyone else's point of view? And that's what I think makes comedy amazing. And although I started as a stand-up, now it's really, I tour with comedy, storytelling, and real teaching and kind of tips and tools. And for that, it's a learning curve. I test, I listen to audience feedback, conversations with people after shows, see what they felt, what hit. Memorizing is the hardest part. Especially like when you saw me at MPI, I had no notes on stage. And right before I went on, someone backstage said, is your whole keynote in the teleprompter? And I said, no, it's in my brain. because my eyes are rolling. I'm not going to be able to follow a teleprompter. And so instead, I rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. If you see me walking outside in New York City, I am running the new part of my keynote. I am running a new joke. I'm constant.
You have like a methodology, like bullet point in your head or
keywords. I go by keywords. So I'll know that, like, if I'm doing the story, one specific story, I have like a visual. And so I have, a story of a kid on the subway who also had Tourette's. And in my mind, there's a picture of a subway that comes after the story before it. But I also am in the moment. And if I don't, some communities or companies will say, you have 26 minutes, don't go over. If that's the case, I stick to what I planned. But if they were to say, you have an hour and there's some wiggle room, I might hear an audience reaction and dive into a story that I hadn't thought about telling in that setting. Or I might get a question from someone that prompts something that I had not planned on doing that day, but I think will be beneficial. And so I'll go into that. So it just depends. But I always, before any keynote, I do like, what are my goals? What is my mission based on the conversations with that company, my mission statement for the day? And what are the 3 key takeaways I hope they get out of it? And so I start from there and then I build it with that in mind. And if I always kind of can go back to that, then if in a moment my brain forgets, I just have to remind myself what the goals are and I can usually get back on track.
Now, I was drawing the comparison in my head when you were talking about the process and the keywords and remembering. It's like selling and the pitch and the objection. And, the more you practice, the better you are. And sometimes there's something new and you add to it. How do you create that? How do you find the material? So yeah, in the case the person told you, I'm going to pray for you, fine. Are you intentional? Said, okay, I'm going to be walking in New York and look at different things that can find inspiration and start writing something, or it just come to you at a totally unexpected moment and you take note of it for later?
If I force the creativity, it doesn't happen. So I kind of just live my life. And then when inspiration hits, I try to remember to write it down. I'm not always successful. There's so many times I will think to myself, oh, Pam, that was such a funny moment. Don't forget it. And then the next day I'll be like, what happened? What was I going to remember? So I do my best to keep notes in my phone, but no, I'd rather just live and let inspiration hit. When it comes to crafting a show, there's intentionality behind that. That's when I go back to all of my jokes and notes and stories and piece together what I think will work for this company, what the takeaways are, and go from there. But when I'm creating, no, I just kind of live and then take notes.
Got it. When you were hired by a company to come and do a keynote, are you researching before? Are you including people and speak? I know the CEO will tell you can include that person and that person and that person, and you build on that.
Yeah. So I like that you call it researching. I call it stalking.
Right. Yeah.
I do a deep dive. I read whatever I can on the website. I always find, their mission, the goals. I do as much as I can. And then I ask to meet with people. Usually it's, whoever hired me and their team, but they have a wealth of knowledge. I wouldn't ever kind of focus on individuals. I don't want to ever feel like I'm calling anyone out, things like that. But I absolutely will learn about the company because if I'm doing a big keynote for a transportation company, traveling with a disability, I have so many stories. What a great opportunity to pull them in. But if I'm doing a high school, different, I'd pull in some different pieces. I'd do more about, my time as an adolescent. That made it sound like prison, my time in adolescence. But yes.
What are your favorite surroundings? What are favorite clients that you have that you would want to have more of based on past experiences?
Ooh, so many. I feel very lucky that I think when a lot of companies want to hire me, they get who I am and what I do. They understand that we're going to also get some comedy and some storytelling in an hour. People are going to laugh and cry. And so I think the best are the companies that are like, here are our goals, but you do you. You deliver it in a way that you think will work. That's my favorite. And I feel very lucky that I've worked with a lot of companies that have been like, we know that you're an expert, although I never feel like I'm really an expert. I don't think anyone does, but we know that this is what you do. And here are our goals. And if you can work it in, you have an hour, have a great time.
How do you build up a keynote and stand up or jokes inside and humor inside in a world where it seems that everybody's waking up in the morning and said, what am I going to be offended by today? And what am I not going to be happy with today? And making it small thing like the major thing that happened in the world.
So a lot of that is I constantly learning, and I'd like to think I don't cross boundaries or cross lines. I do share my story, but I also think when I'm talking about disability, I'm doing it from a place of like, here's my story, here's my educational passion and background, and we can go from there. And I'm open to, I had a joke and I found out recently, and I still can't totally find it online, but someone said that the background of a word I used didn't come from a good place, and I'd never heard it. Of that, I researched it, still unclear, but I took the word out just to be sure. And so I think some of that is, I don't want my keynote to hurt or harm anyone. That is the opposite of the goal. And so when I go into it like that, I'm really kind of staying in my lane and going from there. And if I do ever, and listen, I'm a comedian and I'm human, I'm going to make mistakes, but I think that's kind of the beauty in this, that I'm always willing to learn and grow and kind of meet the world where it is. And I think that's what it takes to not hopefully offend folks.
Thank you. Two last questions for today, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
First and foremost, how can people get in touch with you?
Oh, thank you. I love when people ask that. So my website is pamelacomedy.com, and you can email me directly through my website. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn and Instagram. My Instagram is Pamela Comedy. That one's a little more silly. My LinkedIn is, I think, my name, Pamela Schuller. And I'm always excited to connect and see what it is you're looking for and go from there with communities and companies.
Awesome. And then my last question, you never know who's listening. So what would be one personal dream and one professional dream that you would want to share so that if anyone is listening and want to help you, they're going to reach out to you?
Ooh, okay. So I'll start with personal. During COVID, I wrote a book and I kind of wrote it and put it on the back burner, and I now have some time. And so I'm trying to get it published. It's YA, so it's for teens, but in the people who have read it, my mom read it, loved it. My sister, like, I think YA, when it hits correctly, it's for all ages. And it was about my journey to love what makes me me through barking at boarding school and being forced to write apology letters at boarding school. And it's like funny and heartbreaking, and I'm really proud of it. So if anyone here is in that industry, I've got some meetings, but that's my next few weeks of trying to get that book sold.
I think I can connect you with 2 or 3 people then.
I would love that. Thank you. And professionally, I think if you're looking for a speaker on anything inclusion, mental health, or anything that you think would be, a speaker on embracing your fears, failure, any of those topics that you'd be comfortable with a speaker with a disability delivering, reach out. I probably started doing corporate shows 6 years ago, and I love it. I love the connections. I love the conversations I've had. I love that every show is different. So it pushes me to keep learning and growing. And so I guess that's the other one. Reach out if you're interested. Let's work together.
Wonderful. Pamela, thank you very much. Can't wait to see you again in person.
Yes.
And all the best with everything you're doing. You're doing amazing in your message and your keynote, and truly enjoy meeting you.
You're incredible. And it was an honor to hang out with you today for a bit.
Thank you. Pamela, thank you so much for sharing your story. Absolutely amazing. Very inspiring, emotional, and fun as well, the way you're telling it. Absolutely love everything about it. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to connect with me, please follow me on LinkedIn and go to the website eventbusinessformula.com, where you will find a lot of resources. And if you enjoy this conversation and learn anything, please share it with your network. Thank you. Bye-bye.